Welcome back to episode 11 of the Rugby History Project. I'm your host Hattie, and today is the Winter Olympics special, when Great Britain stole gold. In 1936, Great Britain shocked the hockey world by taking gold at the Winter Olympics. Many myths surround this team. This Winter Olympics special looks at the true story of how Great Britain stole gold from Canada. Whilst the 1936 Summer Olympic Games are perhaps one of the most heavily discussed games of all time, the 1936 Winter Olympics were also held under the same circumstances in Nazi Germany. Held 5 months before their more infamous counterparts, anti-Semitic imagery was removed from the Bavarian ski town where the event was held. Troops were removed from the vicinity, and 2 Jewish athletes were allowed to compete for Germany. It was publicly known at the time that the London persecution of those deemed Untermensch was purely driven by the desire not to offend foreign opinion needlessly. Whilst Nazi iconography was embraced, as many athletes performed a one-armed salute towards the German people and the Führer during the opening ceremony, the most controversial and memorable incident for many was the fact that Canada was beaten in their own game, ice hockey, by Great Britain, losing out on an expected gold medal. The origins of ice hockey, or just hockey for those in the know, are not too dissimilar to those of rugby. Like rugby, hockey as we know it was organised in the 19th century, however similar games have been played for centuries across the globe. Ice hockey as we know it today was primarily developed in Nova Scotia. Colonists from Europe brought games such as bandy, shinty and hurling with them and adapted them to the local climate and conditions. Local indigenous peoples also had stick and ball games played on ice, and sticks from the Micmac tribe were soon in vogue with the white colonists. Unsurprisingly, a company owned by white colonists, the Star Manufacturing Company of Dartmouth, began producing Micmac sticks, which were an instant hit. Men in Great Britain began playing organised ice hockey in the 1890s, roughly 2 decades after the first organised indoor ice hockey game was played in Montreal in 1875. The exact date of the first organised ice hockey game in Great Britain is debatable, as bandy had been popular across East Anglia for a long time. We do know, however, that an organised domestic competition was taking place as early as 1898, with the Admiral Max Challenge Cup being awarded to the English club champions. Interestingly, many of the early club champions had Canadian-themed names, such as Niagara Ice Hockey Club and the London Canadians. The interwar period was a golden age for British ice hockey. After the British Ice Hockey Association was reformed in 1923, having been a founding member of the International Ice Hockey Federation in 1908, the national team won bronze at the 1924 Olympics. From there, the popularity of the sport, especially in London, was explosive. The domestic game was an extremely popular spectator sport, the magazine Ice Hockey World being read by 50,000 people per week. Hockey had previously been confined to the Manchester Ice Palace, but following the explosion, rinks began popping up all over the country. The Grosvenor Hotel in London uniquely had an ice rink up until 1935 and was home to the Grosvenor Canadians. The Canadians would go on to move to Wembley in 1934, where they frequently brought in crowds of 10,000 and were eventually renamed the Wembley Monarchs. The domestic game had taken off to a degree that allowed clubs to recruit overseas players, primarily Canadians, to play in Britain. Whilst the game in North America was primarily professional, the game in Britain was amateur in theory. Players were paid upwards of £10 per week, but they were nominally employed by local businesses or by the rinks themselves. The faux amateur status of the British League allowed for the best British players to play in international competitions, which followed the Olympic amateur rules. In contrast, the best players in North America were professional, the majority playing in the National Hockey League, and were therefore banned from Olympic competition. Canada, therefore, opted to send established senior amateur sides to international competition under the Canadian banner. The initial domestic boom had been caused by international success. However, despite the boom, the British national side continued to finish 3rd and 4th in various international competitions after 1924. After another 3rd place finish in the 1935 World Championships, the BIHA were frustrated. Whilst the domestic game had improved, the nation's international standing had not changed. Bunny Aherne had been born in Ireland in 1900 and had never played ice hockey, yet he would become one of the most important figures in British ice hockey history. A travel agent by day, Aherne was both the secretary of the BIHA and the head coach of the national team during the 1935 World Championships. Aware of the Olympics the following year, Aherne decided to take action. Aherne decided to recruit Richmond Hawks head coach Percy Nicklin to be the new head coach of the national side. Nicklin was Canadian with Scottish parents and was among the most experienced coaches in Britain at the time. Having won the Allen Cup twice with New Brunswick's Moncton Hawks in 1933 and 1934, Nicklin moved to England to coach the Richmond Hawks. With the new Canadian coach in place, Ahern was ready to build his squad. Previous British representational sides had been made up of army officers and professionals who had primarily been born and raised in Britain. However, Ahern had a different idea. Inspired by the influx of Canadian-trained and/or born players in the British leagues, Ahern decided that creating a squad based on Canadian-trained players would be the key to success. Ahern travelled to Canada in the summer of 1935 to tour for British-born players and brought with him captain Carl Erndt. Erndt was an extremely experienced player and at 39 was expected to be one of the oldest, if not the oldest, hockey players at the Olympics. Born in Britain to German parents, Erndt had been educated in Germany and Switzerland, where he'd learnt the game. Migration from Britain to Canada was exceptionally common, and nationality law was extremely different from today. As a member of the British Empire, Canadians were considered British subjects, and Canada itself would not have a distinct citizenship law until a decade later in 1946. As such, it was not difficult for Ahern to find players who had been born in Britain. What proved tricky, however, was convincing the Canadian authorities to let the players leave. With great difficulty, Ahern reached an agreement with the Canadian Amateur Ice Hockey Association that the BIHA would only sign players who had been proved to move by the Canadians. In total, 8 British-born Canadian-raised players would sign for British teams and go on to represent the nation of their birth through this arrangement. 2 of the 8, including Nicklin's 2-time Allen Cup winning goaltender James Foster, joined Erndt along with Robert Wyman, the only member of the squad to be born and raised in Britain, and Gerry Davey and Gordon Daly, who'd both been born in Canada and moved to London during the Great Depression, in the British squad. Preparation for the tournament had gone well, thanks to what was considered an advanced training regime and structured defensive play courtesy of Nicklin. The team were hopeful upon their arrival in Bavaria, but they soon found themselves in hot water. The Canadians claimed that goaltender James Foster, who'd been born in Scotland and moved to Manitoba aged 7, and winger Alexander Archer, who'd been born in England to Scottish parents and moved to Manitoba aged 3, had not received permission from the CAHA to move. Whilst it was erroneously suggested back in Britain that the pair had been banned from hockey due to their conduct in Canada, the pair were simply accused of not adhering to the agreement made between the British and Canadian governing bodies the previous summer. The International Ice Hockey Federation voted unanimously to ban the pair. However, 2 days after the vote, both players took the ice. David Wolonchinski notes in his 1984 book on the Olympics that there are various schools of thought regarding this. Whilst the British claim that the Canadians relented and allowed the pair to compete as a sign of good faith and pride in their Commonwealth status, the North Americans claim that the Brits simply ignored the ban. British newspapers from the period claim that the ban was lifted against the Canadians' wishes by the IIHF before the Games began. The president of the CAHA, however, one E.A. Gilroy, stated that not only were the pair still under a ban, but that upwards of 30 other Canadian pucksters playing on English teams were also banned from ice hockey. With the British team thinking that they put the drama behind them, they moved into the first stage of the competition. The 15 teams enrolled in the event were split into 4 pools. Whilst 3 of the pools featured 4 teams, Great Britain found themselves in the top seed in the pool of 3. Britain found themselves sailing past both Sweden and Japan, with James Foster recording a shutout in both games. Interestingly, Japan's goalie Teiji Honma became the first ice hockey player to wear a mask at the Olympics in his game against Great Britain. The top 2 from each group in the first stage of the competition qualified for a second round robin. This time, Great Britain found themselves in a pool of 4 against 4-time Olympic champions Canada, home nation Germany and Hungary. Canada and Great Britain faced off on the 11th of February 1936 in what would become the defining game of the tournament. The German crowd was reportedly and somewhat surprisingly supporting the British, as the Canadians were accused of whinging. Whilst the rest of the second stage of the competition would go on to be dominated by the Canadians, with a 15-0 win over Hungary and a 6-2 win over Germany, they fell 2-1 to Great Britain thanks to a late last-period screamer by Ontario-based winger Edgar Brenchley. Britain would go on to draw against Germany, who did not play German-Jewish player Rudy Ball due to injury, and a 5-1 win over Hungary. The final round of the Olympics would be extremely controversial and resulted in yet another complaint from the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association. Tournament rules dictated that the final round of competition was yet another round robin, competed by the top 4 sides of Great Britain, Canada, the USA and Czechoslovakia. However, in order to save time at the 1936 Games, relevant results from the second round were carried over into the third round. The Canadians were incensed. Not only was this against convention at the time, but it also put them at a significant disadvantage in the final round. Whilst they attempted, twice, to change the format prior to the third round, their requests were denied. Whilst this has come as a shock to the Canadians, the somewhat bizarre round-robin format had been explained prior to the beginning of the games at a delegation meeting. However, both the Americans and the Canadians had decided not to attend the meeting. Due to the strange format, not only did the USA's 2-1 win over Czechoslovakia count, but so did Great Britain's 2-1 win over Canada. Whilst Canada managed to beat their neighbours 1-0 and Czechoslovakia 7-0, the loss stood firm. Great Britain, on the other hand, also beat Czechoslovakia and fought against the USA for 6 goalless periods. Whilst modern ice hockey rules do not allow for a game to end in a draw, this was not the case for 1936. Having played one less game in the first round and recording 2 draws, Great Britain claimed gold over Canada by 1 single point. England won because she was better coached, and you can give all the credit in the world to our coach, Percy Nicklin. England played the typical Nicklin hockey, the sort of hockey which he taught the double Allen Cup winners, the Mauchline Hawks. We went out to get a goal, and when we got it, we played a tight defensive game. Alexander Archer, 1936. It's fair to say that Canada did not take their silver medal well, with statements not unfamiliar to anyone who spent any time on rugby Twitter or Reddit. It was claimed by the Canucks that the British team was essentially Canadian anyway, and that the competition rules had not been explained to them. The second statement is in fact true. The rules had not been explained to the Canadians. However, this was because the Canadians had not attended the meeting in which they were explained. However, stating that the team was essentially Canadian is a little trickier to unpack. All but 2 of the 13-man squad had a connection to Canada. 9 had emigrated to Canada as children, whilst 2 more had been born there to British parents. Nationality and citizenship law in 1936 were significantly more lax than 2026. It would be the following World War which changed that. However, we can see from the outrage of the Canadians, even prior to their loss, that there was a sense of distinct Canadian nationality, distinct from that of just a British Dominion building. Whilst it may have upset the Canadians, all of the British team qualified for Great Britain via birth or birthright. The continued emphasis on Great Britain's Canadianness can even be seen as recently as 2025, with the Hockey Hall of Fame's timeline of the game stating that the Canadians not only lost on a technicality, but that the British team was effectively Canadian. I hope that you've enjoyed this Winter Olympics special, even though technically it isn't rugby history. I personally like to think that hockey and rugby are the same sport, but just simply in different fonts. Whilst Team GB do not have a spot in either the men's or women's competition at the 2026 Olympics, if anyone needs me over the next coming weeks, I will be sat in front of my television watching every single second. The women's competition starts on the 5th of February, if the rink is finished in time, and the men's competition starts on Wednesday the 11th. I also wanted to take a moment to reflect on the disturbing similarities I found between the normalisation of a fascist regime by athletes in 1936 and the current state of the world. At the 1936 Winter Games, athletes from around the world performed Nazi salutes to Adolf Hitler and the German public. Much like Elon Musk in 2025, the athletes claimed afterwards that it was an Olympic or a Roman salute. Similarly, the nitpicking over ethnicity and nationality of the British ice hockey team, along with the pressure on the Nazis to include 2 Jewish athletes in their delegation, brings forth the West's obsession with immigration in the 21st century. So far in 2026, the world has seen 2 American citizens shot dead by Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents in broad daylight and on camera after being sent to Minneapolis as part of Donald Trump's focus on immigration. Whilst the murders of Renee Good and Alex Pretty have quite rightly sparked outrage as well as calls for the abolition of ICE, it should also be at the forefront of our minds that they are not the only victims. 43-year-old Keith Porter Jr., a black American citizen, was shot dead by an ICE officer in Los Angeles on New Year's Eve. There's been little reporting on his death, and when there has, it's come with a heavy dose of propaganda reserved specifically for black men. 2025 was ICE's deadliest year in 2 decades, with December 2025 being the worst on record. 32 people died in ICE custody in 2025. This number does not include those who were killed on the streets, nor those in Border Patrol custody. With reports that ICE agents will be attending the 2026 Milan Cortina Games as part of American Vice President J.D. Vance's entourage, the attempts to normalise the USA's fascist regime has gone global. With the USA set to co-host the Men's FIFA World Cup this summer, as well as other international sporting events such as a stop on the Severn Circuit and the Summer Olympics in 2028, it's important not only that athletes and spectators do not bend to the normalisation of the regime, but also that we ensure the safety of both those visiting the United States and those residing there. Equally closer to home for myself, we can see how Britain is sliding further to the right, with several political parties echoing far-right statements of the American government. I'd like to thank two of my favourite North Americans, Julia and Peach, for proofreading this article. I appreciate you very, very much. And if you'd like more regular updates, please check out my Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky. It's all the Rugby History or the Rugby History Project, depending on how many characters I'm allowed. You can catch me podding every Tuesday morning with Rap. You can find that on YouTube and other good podcasting locations. New for this week, we have got visuals. We have got actual, you can see me talking, which could be weird, could not be weird. So if you're watching on YouTube, hello. If you are watching on Spotify, because that's a thing, hello. Otherwise, you're listening. You can now watch me. You can find me, the Rugby History Project, obviously. And if you would like any references, as always, it's all available at therugbyhistoryproject.com. Bye.